In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill.
The first lines of Mary's letter are iconic when it comes to the Silent Hill series, with the letter being part of the start of Silent Hill 2. Originally released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2 and receiving an Xbox and PC version over the next couple of years, Silent Hill 2 is considered one of the strongest entries in the series. So in 2022, when it was announced that Silent Hill 2 would receive a remake, developers Bloober Team, who had been behind games such as Layers of Fear and Observer, had some very big shoes to fill considering some of the treatment Silent Hill 2 got in the HD collection, and people holding Silent Hill 2 in such high regard. Despite the game being 23 years old at the time of this review, I will try not to spoil the story and late game footage will be out of context. But if you know, you know. Like in the 2001 original, Silent Hill 2 has you play the role of James Sunderland, a man who has been drawn to Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his wife Mary. The two have precious memories in the town, and it's established quite early that Mary has since passed away 3 years earlier from that damned disease. Thinking it very strange how a dead person could write a letter, James drives to Silent Hill where he hopes to meet Mary at their special place. Throughout his journey, James will meet other people in Silent Hill, some drawn to the town for their own reasons, and one bearing a striking resemblance to Mary. James will also find that the town isn't as it seems, as he has to avoid or fight off monsters, as well as entering hellish otherworldly versions of some of the places he visits. Can James survive the horrors Silent Hill have in store for him? Will he be reunited with Mary? Is this game any good? Find out in The Good. One of the game's greatest strengths is in its story. Silent Hill has been quite heavy when it comes to symbolism, and this game does an excellent job at keeping the key story beats while making the game familiar to those returning to it. There have been some new areas added which complement the game's length, and some of the game's significant events have been moved to different locations alongside some of the puzzles. The game has a feature called Glimpses of the Past which pays homage to these changes when James finds them, as well as add more fuel to the theories around the events of the original compared to the remake. James can also pick up strange photos scattered throughout the game which also have been fueling theories with their significance as well. Most of the game's dialogue has remained, and I think the game's voice direction and acting was quite solid for the remake. There have been some lines removed and minor changes made, but for me a lot of it was fine outside a couple of missing lines and a couple of scenes very late in the game. Even with the added areas and the changes made, this doesn't affect how the original story plays out, and if you're familiar with the original game's endings, they're back in this remake with the ways to unlock them being virtually the same. The remake adds 2 additional endings that you can only unlock in New Game Plus, with one of those endings requiring you to obtain a certain ending first. I personally think the game is quite faithful to the original, and while I don't often replay games straight away, I didn't mind running through this game a second time to experience getting these new endings as they add alternative interpretations to how James ultimately deals with things. To also clarify, the additional story Born from a Wish is not included with this game, but here's hoping we can see Bloober Team's interpretation of it in DLC in future. The game's atmosphere has been nailed perfectly alongside the sound design and monsters. Staff from the original game, such as creature designer Masahiro Ito and composer Akira Yamaoka, returned for the remake, with Ito providing art for the game's location and monsters, and Yamaoka once again working as the game's composer. Some of the design changes have worked very well in the game's favour, and a good example of this is Brookhaven Hospital. When you enter the hospital, the sun's just setting, and for the meantime you're safe and you don't have to worry about being attacked by monsters. As you explore the basement and get power restored to the hospital, you'll notice it's gotten dark outside, it started raining, and the hospital has started to become less safe. Little things like this is what really impressed me with the game's atmosphere. Silent Hill's signature fog is back and does a very good job of obscuring the horrors within too. But personally, the biggest improvement has to be with Toluca Prison. The darkness is so thick that James's flashlight barely lights up some places, the lights to the cells are timed and provide very little safety, and the behaviour of one of the monsters has changed from the original, making you even more paranoid as there's now one more thing to worry about as you make your way around the prison. Ambient noises definitely make the atmosphere more menacing and unsafe, which is something the original has done very well, and the best example of this is once again in the prison. The game has gone from a fixed camera to your traditional third-person camera, bringing the game to a modern audience, and I think it's worked for the better. The game also has a number of accessibility options as well, which I think are quite nice too. Add playing the game at night with headphones on, and if you dare, turning the game's radio off so you don't get advance warning of where the enemies lurk, and you have the ideal environment to enjoy the game in. The game's combat I'm a little more mixed on, so let's talk about the good parts of it first. I found combat much more engaging in the remake over the original. As James fights the monsters of Silent Hill, he can choose to do so with a melee weapon or a ranged weapon. There is a satisfying feeling when James's plank or pipe makes contact with an enemy, and enemy behaviour has been tweaked to account for the updated mechanics, with some enemies even getting new moves. When attacked, James can dodge out of the way, and if an enemy is down, he can stomp on them just to make sure they stay down. Enemies can also dodge James's attack and counter-attack, and I've even come across instances where enemies I thought I had killed will even get up again when I revisit an area later on, which was pretty cool. The game's boss fights have been overhauled, and while they seem familiar, I appreciate the changes to them, especially with one of them which has become a sequence which reinforces its significance to a character in the game. Don't think you can look at your map to pause combat either, as the game will still continue when you look at your map. When you first get a weapon, the game will encourage James to break windows with it, as you can find items hidden in cars and shop windows. This is a good way to get some supplies early in the game, and later on in it, you'll find items in glass cabinets which you can access by having James smash into them. As good as this game is, it does have its faults, and we'll talk more about those in the bad. So let's start with what I didn't like about the combat. While the mechanics are pretty solid, I found a lot of the enemies are quite predictable. Enemies tend to telegraph their attacks, giving James enough time to dodge them, with the only major threats being the bubble-headed nurses who can perform a small combo, and the mannequins ambushing you, especially later on in the game, though at that point you will hear an audio cue so James can dodge. A lot of enemies, if James is fighting them one-on-one, can be dispatched quite easily by shooting the enemy in the knees a couple of times, or in the mannequin's case, their lower knees, which causes them to bend down, just for your plank or pipe to connect with them to finish them off. You'll eventually learn that there's a pattern when swinging your plank or pipe around where you can get a couple of hits in, dodge the enemy's attack, and then get back in there to do another couple of hits. As long as you don't get too greedy in dealing damage, you'll be just fine. Enemies, when they notice James, will come after him, and even if you climb through a hole in the wall, some enemies will even follow you, but this is exactly what you want. You can bottle multiple enemies in an area to take care of them with reasonable safety. The predictability did take away a little bit of the horror factor, but for the most part I was reasonably satisfied with the game's combat. The only other issue I came across was more for the PC version, so I can't speak on behalf of PS5 users. But at the time of review I did notice there were areas where the frame rate just tanks, and my computer, while getting on in years, is still a reasonable powerhouse and should be able to handle the game with little difficulty. The game does offer a lot of graphical options to tailor your experience. Ray tracing to me feels very minimal for this particular game, and outside of the odd mirror and puddle wasn't too much to write home about. Even with DLSS on, I found that there were parts of the game which chugged. However, I would only consider this minor. I'm sure there'll be something in the near future that can remedy the situation, and there's people posting up tweaks and optimal settings so that you can make the most of the game anyway. Other than that, there's nothing else I really have to complain about, so let's wrap things up with the opinion. Silent Hill 2 has been a really impressive remake. The game I felt certainly did the original justice, and Bloober Team have done an excellent job in modernising one of the strongest entries in the series. The game retains its story beats, and while it's familiar to those returning, the extra areas and changes to puzzles is just enough to keep it different so you can't over-rely on what you knew about the original. The new voices, atmosphere, music and sound design work very well in its favour too, with the latter three really helping to build an unsettling and dangerous town. And while I was a bit mixed with the combat being predictable and a little on the easier side, I do like the more modernised approach, and even changing up certain monster behaviours to make parts of the game even scarier. The only other issue I had were performance issues, and while they were minor, it was noticeable and frequent enough for me to mention, though I'm sure these issues will be fixed or tweaked. The remake is a great way to introduce new players to the series and the joys of opening your map every 10 seconds while providing veterans with a familiar yet different approach. The remake is definitely worth picking up, and here's hoping Bloober Team picks up the other games. I'd like to see them take on Silent Hill 4 The Room first before revisiting the original and 3 personally. But enough about that, it's time for the rating. I would give the Silent Hill 2 remake The Little Baroness out of 10. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next Infinite Backlog review. If you enjoyed today's review, feel free to check out some of our other videos and subscribe for more. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram and our Facebook page. Once again, thank you for watching.